Well, greetings, everybody. It's Maynard, Mike, and Jeff here with a really exciting Close of Business Tuesday. We're with Les Csorba. Les is the partner in charge of the Heidrick Struggles office in Houston. He's part of their CEO and board of directors practice. He is a three-time alum of COBT appearances. We're delighted to have him. But let me jump right to the punchline on why we grabbed Les and said, we got to talk to you this week. This is too good. Les and his wife were recently in Ukraine in August. They were there visiting the Heidrick Struggles office, but also helping deliver some things and just kind of help the Ukrainian people. What Heidrick has also done is they've published a study of results of analysis of how Ukrainian CEOs have been managing through this crisis. And so it's a real exercise in understanding leadership under duress, leadership in difficult times, and how leadership modifies to help the organization and its people steer through things like this. Les, this whole thing is fascinating. We can't wait to visit with you about it. It's such a unique piece of work, and it's obviously a humanitarian situation we're all focused on. So thank you so much for joining us.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me again, Maynard. It's nice to see you again.
Awesome. Well, Mike, what would you tell the rest of us and the world about the markets these days? Oil kind of keeps inching up, but let me see what you want to tell us.
Yeah, Maynard, I think the word of the day is volatility. I mean, we've had a lot of volatility, for two reasons. One, oil prices are at $90 right now. WTI, they got as high as $94, $95 WTI, and now we're back here. The second thing is, bonds, bond yields. 10-year bond yield hit 4.5% yesterday, actually a little higher than that. We're kind of around those levels right now. So those are the two things that are influencing the market. I think what people are looking at and concerned with probably over the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks is a couple things. One, you've got the UAW strike. How long that's going to last? What are the implications of that? Two, you've got a government shutdown potentially next week, October 1st. If we don't have things settled or continuing resolution, we're going to have a shutdown potentially. So that's worrisome for the markets. You've got student loan program starts to, the loan starts to kick in sort of mid-October, late October. So you're going to have the drag on the economy with that. And so I just think there's a lot of things that are concerning for the market. And the last thing is really you have fiscal year ending for a lot of mutual funds. So you've got a lot of repositioning in their portfolios. So, because we're coming to the end of the month here. So you have a lot of that going on right now. As far as commodities, crude oil, obviously crude oil is at $90 a barrel. So that's concern. I think what's concerning people right now in the crude oil markets is what's going on with Cushing storage. Cushing storage is around 21.5, 22 million barrels. Most people expect another draw this week to get it down to around 20 million barrels. That's about, where we've been on the lows for the last 5, 6, 7 years. And so if we get lower than that, people start to worry about what happens to the tanks. We've obviously seen the SPR has been drained quite dramatically. People are saying, what's going to happen to tank levels there? Can you damage the reservoir? So that's really influencing the commodity markets at this point in time. And so that's kind of, what we're looking at this, this point in time. So like I said, a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty. Markets are kind of under pressure. And so we would expect you're going to probably see, this continued. Now, what I'd say is a lot of bad news we talked about there. If we get a UAW resolution, if we avert basically a federal government shutdown, if bond yields start to come down, which I think they're going up right now because people are concerned with these issues. If those issues get resolved, then we probably have a little bit of equity market move higher because we're kind of oversold on the equity market. So right now, like I said, a lot of volatility. It's going to be with us for the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Yes, some just looming big picture events that you're highlighting there. Jeff, anything you would throw into the hopper as we turn to Les?
Yeah, just to stay on big picture content. The IEA this morning obviously came out with their updated net zero roadmap. And so, we'll still, there's a lot of time to spend and consume the couple 100-page report, but it was impactful, when that roadmap came out the first time, because so many took it as a forecast and not a scenario. But just using, in the forward to the report, the IEA says, our roadmap became a reference point for governments, companies, investors, and civil society, helping inform discussions and decision making. And so, we just encourage, people to pause on that and to think about, the message in the report, in terms of what it's, laying out, how realistic it is and whatnot, because, we think about things through an analyst lens, and 2050 is a long time out from now. But part of the way I encourage people to think about things is looking at the measuring points along the way, and just to use a couple points that that people will have perspective on. Not just 2050, but the IEA plots a path in 2030 and 2035 for where demand and supply of various sources of energy come from. What the IEA has for coal in 2030 in this net zero roadmap is down almost 50% versus 2022. Has oil and gas down about 20% versus 2022. And so we think about this, forecasts are not what I hope will happen, it's what I think will happen. And so I'd encourage people to think about the message here in the report through a lens of what they think will happen, because that's really important in terms of decision making around investing in sources of energy and thinking about cost implications for what may occur. So I think it's going to be fascinating as people consume the report to think about or to think about all this and where the debate goes and how much impact this report does or doesn't have going forward.
No, it's pretty incredible, Jeff. Thanks for highlighting. And last week, I believe we had the Fadi Barol commentary in the Financial Times, and then we had that sort of unprecedented, I thought, OPEC official, counter observation. So that it's a fascinating thing that's going on. Well, Les, as you can hear, this is why we love energy. There's always many interesting things happening with interesting players and forecasts and market data and such. Les, you've been such a good friend over the years. In all seriousness, it's always fun to have you on. But this report, when we saw it, it's so striking. What a unique piece of analysis. Coming out of obviously just a terrible situation. Could you give us the background for how Heidrick you have a Kyiv office and such. How did you think of doing this? Because it's very, very thoughtful.
Yeah, we've obviously put out so many interesting studies over the years on leadership and trends in leadership. I just can't think of anything more compelling than this piece that my colleagues actually both in Kyiv and in our Warsaw, Poland office pulled together. So in the middle of a war, they've gone out and interviewed 15 plus large scale CEOs of, mid-cap, large cap companies operating in Ukraine during wartime to get a sense of their, what they're learning during wartime, being a wartime CEO, if you will. And then the lessons that they believe can help all leaders, including, frankly, I think a lot of these lessons apply to CEOs and executives and board members in the energy space, certainly here in the US and around the world. So that's why it was so meaningful and powerful to me, and excited to share it with friends like you.
Well, I mentioned it in the lead-in that you and your wife had just been there, so you've seen it and experienced it. What would you just tell us about that experience, just physically being there, what you saw and kind of the attitudes of people there on the ground?
Yes, it's, this was our second trip. I actually went to Hungary and Ukraine about a month after the war broke out in March of 2022, primarily because of my family background. Both my parents were Hungarian refugees in 1956. They were teenagers. They fled Hungary when the Russians invaded and shut down the Hungarian Revolution. And so my parents were two of about 250,000 refugees that came to the United States and Canada. So I feel a strong connection, obviously, to what's going there, particularly to the Ukrainian refugee issue. I think there's been now 15 million Ukrainians that have had to leave their homes, 7 or 8 million of which left the country. Many are coming back, by the way, now, which is an important point that we should discuss. But I would say my observation of being on the ground is just this incredible Ukrainian spirit that I'm sure you all have followed. That they're literally obviously fighting for their survival, for things that probably, we take for granted, right? Freedom, self-determination, liberty, the right to live your life as you choose. And so they, I think, are at the tip of the spear, frankly, in fighting this battle for the values that we all cherish here in the United States. But there is a resiliency, there is an optimism. They are just incredibly inspiring people. Obviously, there is an amazing sense of unity in the country, which is unfortunate we don't have that here, which is really remarkable and powerful and inspiring. So every time I'm with the Ukrainian people, I just get so much energy and so much inspiration, being on the ground there.
And life in Kyiv, is it sort of back to quote normal? Have they? Is it functioning fully, or what does it feel like there?
Yes, I think that was one of the other observations. Is it's very important for the war effort to have business continuity, right? I mean, the success of the economy, the functioning of businesses is critical to the war effort, and Ukrainians are hard at work in their businesses. So there is a sense of somewhat normalcy under this obviously constant threat of, air raid. There are lots of air raid sirens. The Ukrainians have obviously an air defense system now around the big cities in Kyiv and Lviv, and obviously towards the front lines. So yes, there is a sense of normalcy, business continuity, but it's under this cloud of this constant threat of a Russian missile attack. So there's still obviously fear, but amazing courage and resiliency.
Les, what would you tell us, just out of curiosity? You mentioned, so you have your Kyiv office, and you also have the Warsaw office, and then you were on the ground in Hungary a little bit post-invasion. Is there a sort of as far as you can tell, I know this is a hard question, but the Eastern European, Ukrainian, I assume there's sort of a solidarity and a real passion for just determination that the Russians, not only do they need to be pushed back in Ukraine, but I think everybody's probably united on dealing with them probably a little more aggressively. Is that fair? What would you say about the broader sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is clearly unity among the Central and Eastern European countries, perhaps with the exception of Hungary, interestingly enough, which has taken more of a neutral position in the war effort. Although Hungary has received, over 600,000 refugees, and so they've provided tremendous humanitarian support. But obviously Poland, Slovakia. These are the countries that really are leaning in. There's some obviously differences with respect to how much the West should be supporting the Ukrainians from a military standpoint. I actually wish we would be doing more instead of sort of this incrementalism of providing military equipment, because I have no doubt that the Ukrainians will win this war. The question is at what cost? And the lives that are being destroyed, the families that are being destroyed, the loss of life, it's really gut-wrenching. And the Ukrainian people want to fight this war. They don't need, Western troops or American troops on the ground, but they do need our technology and our military equipment to continue to push the Russians back. That's probably the most frustrating thing for those of us that are on the ground, to hear the Ukrainians cry out for more support from a military standpoint, because they will do the job. They are fighting literally for their survival and for their self-determination and independence. And so, as you know, there's some policy differences on that issue that we probably, don't have time or not qualified to explore further.
So, Les, is the attitude there, as far as you can tell, wow, the West and led by the U.S. has really come to our side and is sort of a, kind of that World War II feeling? Or is it more of a, boy, there's a lot of hand-wringing in the West about exactly how much we're going to do and when. And so it's not quite as, it's not the partnership that it might be.
No, I think there is a tremendous amount of gratitude towards the U.S. and our government and our support, the moral support, obviously the financial, military, humanitarian support, incredible graciousness and gratitude. So I certainly don't want to give that impression, but I think despite that, there is still this desire, and you hear it from Zelensky, you hear it from the military commanders on the front line, that they wish that we could do more. For example, obviously there was we didn't get them the F-16s until recently, really through our allied countries in the Netherlands and Denmark. So that was slow to come in terms of creating some, air, at least some equivalence in terms of the air and providing, F-16s. And the Ukrainians they just need the time to be trained, in terms of their pilots flying this modern, sophisticated, planes. But there's a huge sense of gratitude. I don't want to, create that misimpression.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, let me shift back to kind of part of the initial focus. You do have these, you referenced it, internally, Heidrick does a lot of studies around leadership, just as part of your craft, if you will. And
Right.
This is sort of a latest series in that type of thinking. Maybe tell us a little bit about that group, because that's an interesting area to be researching. It makes total sense for your business. That's what you guys do. You find leaders and find board of director members. But maybe tell us a little bit about that group and how long it's been going and some of the other things it's looked into.
Well, our CEO and board practice is global. And so needless to say, we operated, on a global platform. We work very closely with our colleagues around the world. Obviously, we have a global energy practice. We're in every major petro center around the world. And we like to study leadership, and unique situations like this. Our Kyiv office is in the middle of a war, and they went out and interviewed 15 plus CEOs, and they shared some really, I think, important lessons that are relevant to all of us, whether we're in wartime or not. They're highly relevant and practical, and that's what's so compelling about the report.
Well, the lessons, you just referenced it as you go through them, and we'll attach the report, if you don't mind, to this class.
Thank you.
But the things that are highlighted, as you said, there's certainly there's this wartime backdrop, which of course informs all this. But many of the things that are highlighted seem like the kind of things, as you said, you should be doing anyway. I know it's hard to run at kind of wartime intensity when it's not wartime, but these are things that really, you might hit on a couple of them, but a real candor, passion for the organization, and the way in which the organization communicates, all those things really jumped out as we went through it.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of highlights from the report. First of all, this idea of underestimating the threat, right? Many CEOs and boards, I think, sometimes underestimate the geopolitical risk to their businesses. And these Ukrainian CEOs, what impressed me so much is how they prepared for different scenarios, scenario planning for the future. I think the second point is how they've adapted to war conditions and sort of business continuity. Now, obviously COVID, was a serious health issue, but I'm not sure it comes close to being in a wartime when your country's being invaded and you're literally fighting for your survival. But I think there was a sense in which American CEOs and energy CEOs did a pretty good job of adapting and focusing on business continuity. But the points that really resonated with me from this report of lessons learned. Number one, operating in the here and now, being present now, taking advantage of every moment and hour and every precious day to execute your business plan, support your people, build culture. Such an important point. Obviously, decision making, they're making high speed decisions, which is, I think, helpful for all of us, and how to learn to move quickly and perhaps not over deliberate and analyze, being decisive. When you're in a war time environment, everything is black and white because the enemy. And sometimes in business, the enemy, you sometimes overcomplicate decisions. I think the point you mentioned around candor, speaking with radical candor, a point that I think many leaders maybe tend to shy away with, being direct. Feedback is a gift, right? And of course, in Ukraine right now, they have to deal with the reality. And so speaking with candor, radical candor, is another important piece that came out of the study.
I thought one thing that actually you mentioned this, businesses with geopolitical exposure, planning for that, trying to estimate that. There was an example in the article where one of the executives, I think in the run up to the invasion, this executive planned for full-on invasion, even though he believed that was not probable. And then He was so pleased he did. I thought that was an interesting example. And then the other ones were even the companies that made sort of what you might call, slight plans or preliminary plans, not full plans. They were so pleased that they had done something.
Right.
As opposed, so I don't know, you might touch on that, but that felt like there was a lesson in there.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard to predict exactly what would happen in February of 2022, but these forward-thinking, strategic CEOs were thinking about all those scenarios. The thing that impresses me the most, Maynard, is how they're planning for the future. Right? In a post-war Ukraine, massive reconstruction effort. Our office in Kyiv has already pulled together a plan around how leadership and talent is going to be critical to the reconstruction effort in Europe and Ukraine post-war. I mean, if you think about the Marshall Plan in Europe post-World War II, obviously a lot of that was humanitarian assistance and aid, but a key part of the success of the Marshall Plan was developing and leveraging talent and leadership, right? And so our office is engaging in thinking about what that will look like. Incidentally, as it relates to the energy business, and I know you know this, Maynard, Ukraine has a massive resource of natural gas that is untapped and has been undeveloped. And there's a huge opportunity for American energy companies, service companies, to help them develop that. I think they're the largest. They have the second largest natural gas reserves in all of Europe, second to Norway. So there's a lot of opportunity post-war. And what impresses me about the Ukrainian CEOs in our office there is how they're looking forward and thinking about those scenarios.
The other thing, sort of struck by, obviously in wartime, this makes sense. All the sort of non-necessary things we do in business are just instantly eliminated, right? And you probably realize there's a fair amount of that stuff that honestly we could eliminate anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the second thing you notice is businesses working together much more efficiently, because that, you just don't have the luxury of doing it on your own or being sort of hyper competitive. And that was another striking thing.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece that's related to that, Maynard, is just the leadership style. CEOs just are in Ukraine, obviously have to set personal examples and model kind of the servant leadership. Everybody chips in, everybody rolls up their sleeves, right? There's no time for egos. There's no time for prima donnas. It's CEOs and leaders who roll up their sleeves and get in the trenches with their people and really, serve them. Transparency, much more transparent. That is motivating, I think, to employees and the team. And so that kind of leadership is being modeled, I think, by the CEOs in the Ukraines. And it's a great lesson for us here in the US in our businesses.
Les, I had to go back and look at the last time you were on the show was roughly 2 years ago. And back then, WTI was at 72. It's at 90. Natural gas was around $5. It's $2.50. The long bond, the 10-year bond was 1.5%. It's at 4.5% today. And over that time frame, the XLE, which is the energy sector, is up about 90%. The S&P is flattish. And ICLN, which is sort of a clean energy type ETF, is down around 35%. And so my question with that lead-in is, how do you think managements have changed since then from a board standpoint, I'm talking fossil fuel management teams. Right. They're thinking back then, they're thinking today about, their businesses, the energy transition. It seems like companies back then were really more on the defensive. It seems like now they're not so much on the defensive. They're really kind of supporting their businesses, but also in the energy transition. Maybe talk about the leadership, the board, thought process 2 years ago and where they are today.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you put that into perspective. Look, I think that I'm impressed, frankly, with the leadership in our industry over the last 2 years. Tremendous capital discipline, as you know. There's a real desire to return value to shareholders. Obviously, produce highly economic barrels of production, but do it in the context of continuing to lean in and reduce your emissions footprint, right? So the energy transition, for those of us that I think really understand what that means, it's about producing more plentiful, reliable, affordable energy at a lower emission footprint, right? That's the objective. And what I've been impressed with are the boards and the management teams, particularly in the E&P side, in terms of their discipline and making sure that they're creating value for shareholders.
Les, in Mike's question, Mike, that was really striking, that contrast. Are you noticing when someone comes to you and says, we need a new CEO or we need a new board member, are you noticing that they're saying anything different about what that person should look like? Any trait or characteristic that is now a little more valued, or just what would you tell us there?
Yeah, I think the strategic piece has become even more pronounced. The ability to look around the corners. I don't think boards are really interested in one-dimensional, functionally, seasoned executives that maybe are strong in one area like finance or operations or commercial. It's more of the full package. The second point I would make, Maynard, is there's a clear interest in leaders that truly understand the regulatory environment, the policy environment. They're diplomatic, in terms of style. They can work with external constituencies and stakeholders. I think that's another skill set that we see boards looking for in CEOs. So I would say it's the strategic piece and it's that external piece that has become very important.
And to kind of piggyback on what Maynard's saying, we've seen two major oil companies changes at the top, BP for reasons on their own, but also in Shell. And so those are two of the companies that most tacked towards energy transition the most aggressively, and they seem to be pulling back. And so it almost feels like, I guess the question is, do you see more that it seems like there's more of a balanced approach being brought to the boardroom now? And it seems like that's kind of what you're saying. We want a more balanced individual rather than someone that's in fantasy land. Yeah,
clearly much more pragmatic, much more thoughtful about what the energy transition means and how to prepare your businesses for the future. I thought it was interesting, and I'm sure you all noticed this weekend, the Financial Times reported, getting back to Europe for a second or for a minute here, the EU's top energy official conceded that Europe is going to need American gas for several decades. that was a huge concession, because now it helps clear the path forward for European buyers who've been perhaps hesitant to sign deals with U.S. suppliers, LNG companies, beyond 2030, right? So that is a reality that I think officials and leaders are starting to understand, and I just thought that was an interesting development.
And Les, maybe to stay on the topic of trends you're seeing, in energy boards. So, increased regulatory and policy experience, that makes sense. More multifunctional, I think the push to have a diverse board, that seems persistent. But are you seeing more of an appetite for experience in the traditional energy business for going on boards? Because we kind of pivoted away for that for a bit of time. Or what non-energy experiences do you think are most applicable to drive that kind of multifunctional benefit to the board dynamics?
Such an interesting question, and I think an important one. We're actually seeing the E&P companies and the service companies maybe shift back towards recruiting directors that really know their business. We got away from that a little bit, in the push for diversity, and diversity's been, that's been huge. It's not just diversity in terms of gender and ethnicity, but diversity of experience, diversity of background. The second part of your question, what are the most relevant industries that boards are looking for, energy boards are looking for? I think it's related industrials, manufacturing, businesses that are also, cyclical in nature, businesses that have geopolitical risk, businesses where there's obviously tremendous regulatory risk and issues. So we do see energy boards still looking outside the industry, but generally in that profile that I shared.
So Les, one thing that's interesting about boards is, you obviously Heidrick has a broad-based global all industries board selection and
right.
candidate process. Are you finding that big industrial companies or companies that just have some exposure to energy, that energy is a big input, that they're coming to you guys and saying, it would be really nice if we had an experienced energy professional on our board, because that's become such a big role in our business? Is that happening?
Yes, very much so. Glad that you mentioned that. Some of the large global industrials are actually looking for seasoned oil and gas and energy experience to have somebody on the board that can help advise and lean into the strategic discussions of where energy is going, right, over the next several, at least the next decade or two. So that's an important skill set. I think we forget that you have such great talent in our space. Technology. Think about the innovation and technology advances in the energy business. Obviously operating in geopolitical risk, huge regulatory issues they have to manage. So that background, that profile becomes very attractive to a large global industrial business. And so we're definitely seeing that. Certainly on the last 2 or 3 assignments, the energy profile has become more attractive.
Unless any data you could give us on just the volume of need that's going on in the energy space in terms of how many CEOs you're looking for, how many CEO spots are going to become open, how many board seats are coming up. Is there just a sense of the volume of what either you're doing or what's happening broadly in the space?
Well, two points to that. I probably can't give you any specifics, Maynard, but I can give you a couple of clear trends. Number one, and I think we've talked about this in the past, there is a huge talent crisis in energy. There have been a number of reports. We put out our own report on it recently. There just aren't as many, geologists and engineers that are graduating from, leading schools, getting into the industry. That's had an impact over the last 10 years. And then, of course, you have the talent crisis on the new energy side, right? Because you have a lot of new startups and new businesses, and they need to scale. They need to be profitable, and so they're fighting for talent. Many of whom, by the way, come from the traditional oil and gas industry or the power utility sector. So there is this war for talent that generally is going on that obviously we're in the middle of. The second part to that question is we are clearly seeing a trend in energy where there's more CEO succession and CEO search work than board work. It used to be the other way around. We were doing a ton of board work over the last 5 to 7 years. I'd say in the last year to two, we're seeing more CEO succession related work. I think that could be attributed to a couple of things. Number one, obviously equity values have recovered and increased. So we're seeing more retirements. We're seeing boards in the energy space lean in a little bit more ahead of time, 3, 4, 5 years ahead of an event, which, obviously they use us as an advisor to help assess internal talent and do external market maps. So the short answer to your question, Maynard, is yes, a lot more activity on the CEO search and succession side. And I think we're going to see that play out in the next year to 18 months.
And Les, this is a mechanical question, but it's kind of interesting. Are you noticing anything in your practice, boards or CEOs, but let's stick with boards, around how boards are being compensated and how that could be changed? Is the compensation getting more aligned with certain, performance metrics, or is there any change going on there?
Not a huge shift. I mean, I think there's been a general trend over the last 3, 4, 5 years, Maynard, towards directors, having more stock and equity so that their interests are aligned to the business and the success of the business and creating shareholder value. So I think that's clearly been a trend across, most boards. I think on the margins, we've seen other factors and elements added, such as, I don't know if I'd refer to it as ESG, but, how the company is doing with respect to achieving some of their scope 1 and scope 2 emission objectives. We see a little bit of that, of course. That's an important consideration. Shareholders are looking at that. But I think it's just more along the lines of, more equity being more invested in the business as opposed to cash.
And thinking about Jeff's question about flavors you want to add to your board, I guess much like industrial companies like having an energy expert or experienced person on their board, are you noticing some classic energy companies liking to have a power person? Is that a popular flavor? Because I think one thing we've been observing is, of course, that we talk about a lot of change as it relates to oil and gas, but where change is meeting where it's really the worlds are colliding is around power and how that power is produced and so on and so forth. So is there an increased interest in power executives for energy companies?
I would say perhaps in a few instances, Maynard. I mean, the only downside to that background, and I have nothing against power and utility executives, they're wonderful and they do a great job, but typically those businesses are, smaller margin businesses, more, they just don't have the kind of complexity and growth kind of performance and margins that a complex global oil and gas or service company has. So in some cases, they may not be as attractive, but in some cases they are, particularly, the dealing with the regulated issues and perhaps maybe bringing a new energy or renewable perspective if they've been exposed to that side of the business. That can be helpful as well to an energy business.
And Les, another thought, just and Mike mentioned it, right? We've been through such a roller coaster here in the public markets and in sentiment and in everyone's understanding of where energy may be heading. And for a while, we had that SPAC environment, which was creating so many new companies, which meant obviously CEOs and boards and things like that. What is your observation on what's happening on the quote other side of the house, the new energy side of the house, or the fallout from so many new companies getting created and the surge that caused for positions like the ones you fill?
Yeah, I mean, I have one colleague in Houston, Clayton Sears, who leads our new energy renewable business, and he is extraordinarily busy. His team, here in the U.S. and in Europe, going back to the point around the talent crisis, it's huge on the new energy side. These businesses, as we all know, are under pressure to produce profitable businesses. They have huge subsidies, and they've got to prove to their shareholders they can be successful. And the key is talent. The key is leadership, right? It's you've got to have the right operational and commercial leadership on the teams and the right boards. That's a huge part of what we do on the new energy side. And it's all about talent. It's all about leadership. And by the way, they're competing pretty aggressively in the market for that talent. So consequently, that has ratcheted up compensation on that side and making those businesses even more expensive to operate from a G&A perspective. So another sort of interesting unintended consequence, perhaps.
And I assume if your partner were here, he would tell us something like the interest by those companies in experienced commercial engineering, technical. Maybe I, have worked my career in classic energy, that the desire for those types of people has gone up as these types of companies, try to quote transition to a operational.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that this is where I think both sides of the energy, I'm an all of the above guy, as Maynard, can be working together, right? I mean, I think we could be learning from each other. I think the new energy side or businesses have huge opportunity to pull talent and learn from our space, where we've had to operate in, difficult, have just had the license to operate, right? I mean, the land issues, the safety issues, the operational issues, these are all highly relevant to the new energy side, right? Just getting access, the whole NIMBY issue, not in my backyard. There's just so many opportunities for the two sides, if you will, of the energy value chain to be working together, particularly from a talent perspective.
Les, you'll appreciate this. I was at the Ham Institute yesterday, and there was I started hearing a new expression, which is all of the above, as long as it's economic. So you do have,
nice.
which is a nice potential add-on there. Let me just, before I turn it back to Mike and Jeff for some more questions from them, I want to get back to the Ukraine study. And I guess what I want to ask you, I just want to hit some of the key things that are in this study in terms of like the lessons learned. So one is the executives are putting their people first. They're planning for continuity in every instance. And then they're adapting their behavior. You say they're concentrating on the here and now.
Yeah.
They're making high-speed decisions. They're communicating 24/7. These executives are setting a personal example. They're speaking with radical candor, and then they are embracing empathy.
Yeah.
And the last one was they're willing to change.
Right.
So what I just wanted to ask you, as you think about those characteristics, and this is coming out of wartime, but when you think of the best CEOs, for instance, in the U.S. energy space, I mean, isn't this kind of sort of how they're running the company? Anyway, I mean, aren't these characteristics the ones you want, whether it's a challenging situation like the one in Ukraine or not?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, some of these things may seem fundamental, but I would just say they become more acute and they become more pronounced, obviously, in a wartime setting, which is why it's so relevant. These are such good reminders for leaders and executives and CEOs in the energy space. Servant leadership, transparency, modeling the right behaviors, speaking with candor, right? Being direct. Feedback is a gift. the empathy piece is huge. The more empathy I think a leader has, the better they're going to be able to create followership, right? Obviously, the EQ has radically increased among CEOs in the Ukraine. How can it not, right? Thousands of Ukrainians are literally dying on the front lines. Everybody is directly or indirectly impacted by the board. And I guess the question is, what if we operated, with that high level of EQ in our businesses? The one thing I wanted to share that really was powerful from this study is how are these CEOs surviving and coping personally, individually? What is it that they're doing to survive in this very difficult environment? And the thing that came out of the study is, number one, they have an even stronger emotional connection with their families. Family is first, right? Yes, the business is important, but what grounds them are their families. The second thing is how they focus on the big things. To your point earlier, Maynard, the minor stuff, the distractions, you just get rid of. You focus on the big objectives, which in their case is the future survival of their country. I mean, their kids' futures are literally at stake to live in an independent Ukraine. The right to life and liberty and pursuit of happiness, the things that, the American ideals and values that perhaps we take for granted. And then the third thing that I would say finally, which I think was so compelling out of this study, is these CEOs are surviving and coping by taking care of themselves. Self-care is critical. In order to care for your employees, in order to care for your families and your neighbors, you have to start by caring for yourself, which means, rest and relaxation. And for those that are, spiritually focused. And by the way, Ukraine is a very spiritual, very Catholic country. Prayer, family time, all of these things that get you grounded, where you're taking care of yourself first, that then gives you the strength and the ability to take care of your people, your employees, your customers. That to me was a pretty massive point out of the study.
To keep going down that path around leadership, I mean, you guys have studied leadership in so many ways. Maybe talk a little bit about, how you'd see leadership in crisis versus leadership, not in peacetime, but in a more normalized environment. Because I think so many of the behaviors around candor and, the leadership attributes in wartime are translatable to any time. But what would you say, would be different in less of a crisis mode?
I think staying committed to your plan and your people. I think what's fundamental in any situation is constantly investing in your teams and your people, because it's all about sustainability. It's all about building businesses to last. And the companies that have competitive advantage, the leaders that have competitive advantage are the ones that are investing in their teams and their people today. And I think sometimes businesses and leaders forget that because they're so focused on maybe getting a deal done or a transaction. The way that I would maybe frame it up is invest in relationships as opposed to transactions. Relationships are going to be, they're more eternal. The transaction is temporal, right? So think about the things that are more eternal and sustaining to the business, and it's people. It's investing in them. It's developing them. It's coaching them. It's providing feedback. That to me is really the essence of great leadership in a perhaps non-wartime environment.
Yeah, Les. Just going to give you a couple of stats and ask you a question. But energy as a percent of the S&P is around 5%. Energy's cash flow and free cash flow is around 12 or 13%, and those have been highly correlated over time. And I think the two reasons are one is Jeff mentioned earlier, the IEA. I think most people are thinking that we're going to peak at some point. I think it's further in the future, but I think there's a concern. But I think the bigger concern is the amount of inventory that companies have. I think most people think that tier one inventory is a lot lower than most people think. And so we're just not going to have sustainability of those cash flows. So maybe the question is how are companies thinking about maybe consolidation because of the maturity of their portfolios? And how does that influence them maybe thinking about going overseas or international or just more into energy transition?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that many businesses are having to think about, in this environment of consolidation, making sure that, if they're part of a consolidation or they're acquiring a business, that they continue to have the right skill sets that allow them to make the right decisions, investment decisions. And so, they just have to be, it goes back to scenario planning. It goes back to strategic planning. It's being able to think and look around the corners. So that's an important skill set.
Just as we wrap up and also wrap up on the report, there seems to be a thread in the report around leadership, which is, I mentioned some of the bullets already. We've talked about a number of them, but there's sort of a don't be a groupthink corporate person. I feel like it's not said exactly like that, but it is a, do what is best for the organization, whatever it is, a type philosophy. I wish, so many more institutions had those types of philosophy, but is that a fair way to summarize it? It's sort of like shed your corporate think and your kind of ladder climbing and just do what's right.
Yeah, I think, getting back to your core values, what is the purpose and meaning of your business, doing the right thing, staying true to your values, making sure that you surround yourself with the multitude of counselors, not a sycophant who's just going to give you, advice and information that you want to hear. Those are important principles to your point, to have independent thinking, as opposed to the groupthink mindset that you might find across the industry. So I think that's another key piece that came out of the study, is just surrounding yourself with really smart people and that have different perspectives and points of views.
Well, so as we wrap up here, we think about our everything that went into the stew that was today's conversation. Maybe a couple of places to end. One is Zelensky himself, which is interesting because I think in the pre-war sentiment, he was underestimated, and he's been able to seize the moment and become the leader for the time. But then the second question, if you have any comments on that, the second one, Les, is, as we always do this, is we're thinking energy 10 years out.
Right.
And how this thing continues to develop, and it's week to week, but yet there is a bit of a North Star here. What would you tell us about him, and then the direction of energy?
Well, on Zelensky, I, obviously admire him greatly. What a transformational leader, from basically an actor and a comedian to a serious politician, and then he becomes a wartime, almost Churchillian figure in history. And I don't want to necessarily plug movies, but I'll tell you what, Sean Penn, who I don't necessarily agree with on all things, has created a powerful documentary film that is just out called Superpower. It's on Paramount Plus, and it is must viewing to understand the man, Zelensky, and his background, his leadership, how he's navigating this situation is pretty powerful. And I would encourage all the listeners to take a couple hours and watch that documentary. With respect to the energy business, I don't think I've been more excited, Maynard, about the energy business. So I think the next decade is going to be extraordinarily exciting. There's so many issues and obstacles to tackle. I think the IEA said that we're going to need, 50% more energy by 2050, right? And so the all above approach, the capital discipline among energy leaders, the investment in talent, solving complex questions of the whole social license to operate. I just think it's exciting. And I encourage young people, that I meet with in their late 20s and early 30s. If you want to be part of a business that is going to thrive and that is exciting, where you can have an impact on people's lives, get into the energy business, the oil and gas business. And certainly, if you're interested in the new energy side, that's great. But energy is life. And it's exciting what's going to happen, I think, over the next decade.
Well, those are great thoughts to end with. And I think, Les, we're going to make some new history with COBT. We're going to attach a link to a Sean Penn production. I don't think we've...
Well, I'm not getting any financial benefit. I just was so moved. I've seen it 3 times now. It's powerful.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us, Les. And this type of work is fascinating. And I think as we look at the next 10 years, it's funny. The biggest variable we have is leadership, whether the leadership is coming out of Washington, D.C. or at company levels or at investment firms, whatever it is, the UN, the IEA. The big question we have is around leadership. And the more they're candid and sincere and genuine and trying to do the right thing, the better it'll be for all of us. So your report really resonates. We loved it.
Well, thank you again. Thanks for having me, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Hey, we look forward for appearance number 4, Les.
I'd love it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.